Hi everyone, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, the 15th. So I wanted to draw your attention to the notes below because there are some changes in terms of due dates. As you know, we're approximately a class behind or so. So in terms of paper number 1, I've given an extension until Tuesday, the 20th, though certainly you can hand in your paper prior to that. And that means that there will be adjustments for the rest of the semester as well. In fact, if you were to look at our notes and go to the section entitled Course Outline, and that's section 5, you'll see that we will be finishing Jane Eyre on Tuesday, the 20th. Obviously, we're beginning Jane Eyre during this class. That means that your Jane Eyre journal would be due on the Thursday, the 22nd. Now, the bulk of the readings are at the first part of the semester. That's the good news. So what is left is for us to talk a little bit about Emily Dickinson, which we will do next Thursday on the 22nd. I have a documentary for you to watch about Emily Dickinson, and then I'm going to ask you to select an Emily Dickinson poem, and I'll give you some places where you could find a poem. Talk a little bit about why that poem spoke to you. We'll discuss a little bit about how Emily Dickinson is not necessarily easy to decipher. Even the scholars and the critics say that. But she has great aptitude at being able to express emotional states in language. And there will be no journal due for Emily Dickinson because basically what you would be doing in your class discussion form would be similar to what you would be doing in a journal, and that I will ask you to select an Emily Dickinson poem and to talk a little bit about why you were moved by that particular poem to share it with us. And that means that on Tuesday, the 27th, we are reading Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Now, I had initially had 2 classes planned for that particular text. I'm happy to say that that text moves very quickly, and it's a text that we could do in one class, and I have done in one class. And what we get is a story that is in direct contrast to something like Persuasion. As many of you had indicated that it was not the easiest read, and these are not the most attractive of characters. We know that their major concerns are about money and status. It's a time of society that's all about decorum and appearance, and their concerns about money are not being able to maintain their lifestyle. In other words, a reduction in servants. That's a very different situation than what we are going to see in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Not only do we get a slave narrative, but we get a slave narrative from the female perspective. So the text will talk not just about slavery, but will also talk about gender and how both of those inequalities serve as a kind of intersectionality for our main character. And the fact that she could even write, because obviously education was denied to slaves, is a story in and of itself that is addressed. It basically is an autobiographical narrative. It's a very quick read. And even though it may not have necessarily all of the literary elements that we've seen in previous texts, I think we still see how this author was not only able to relate her own personal experience, but make social commentary as well. And that would leave our very last class on the 29th to The Awakening, which happens to be a novella, as I had indicated earlier. It's our return to Kate Chopin. So we started with Kate Chopin, A Story of an Hour, and we end with The Awakening, a woman who experiences multiple awakenings. I don't want to give away too many spoilers. And that means that the following class on Tuesday, that is the 4th of July, so it's Independence Day, so we would not be meeting, but we will be meeting on the 6th, and that's Thursday. That would be our very last class where we would have our final examination. What the final exam is going to be is an essay exam, and I'm going to give a series of essay questions and ask you to choose 2 of those questions. And if we were taking this class in a face-to-face situation, you would have 2 to 3 hours to take that exam. Since we're doing it online, you'll have 24 hours to take the exam. That said, I don't expect you to spend 24 hours taking the exam. You should spend 2 to 3 hours taking the exam. It's open book, open notes. So it's not a question of memorization. It's a question of being able to synthesize the elements that we've talked about over the course of the semester. And I realize that the writing you do for the final won't be as neat or polished as something you would do for a journal, let's say, or for a paper, nor do I expect it to be. But I do expect that you are able to put together the elements of the course and be able to express that in writing. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of these upcoming assignments as we get a bit closer. But I just wanted to again draw your attention to the 5th section in the notes below and some of the changes with our course outline. In terms of journals, after you submit in your Jane Eyre journal on the 22nd, which is Thursday, you have 2 additional journals left. Again, you don't need to submit in a Dickinson journal, but you would be submitting in a journal for Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl and also The Awakening. Because this is towards the ending of the semester, I will take those journals up until the day of the final exam, which is the 6th of July. But the sooner the better, obviously, for everyone involved, especially if you wanted to use the journals for your second paper. And the 6th, the day of your final exam, is also the due date of paper number 2 as well. So that would be a very similar sort of exercise to what you did with paper number 1. By that point, I would have returned paper number 1 with you. As you know, I evaluate for grammar and mechanics as well as for content, and would put a letter grade rather than a checkmark grade. And if you're content with your grade with the first paper, you're done. But if you wanted to rewrite it, you could do so for a higher grade. I just ask that you submit in the original with my comments along with your revision, and you would get the higher of the 2 grades. And the first grade, which I assume would be the lower grade, would disappear, which is I don't think any kind of unfair advantage, because professional writers really go through lots of editorial processes. So lots of revisions and lots of drafts and lots of edits. The second paper, because it's due at the very ending of the semester, there would not be time for you to rewrite that paper. Occasionally I've had students who have handed in the second paper early enough so that there is a possibility of revision, but it's something you would have to negotiate with me. It's not something that's guaranteed the way it is with the first paper. So again, in terms of upcoming assignments, and this is in section 4, before the section 5 in course outline and the notes below, paper number 1 will be due this Tuesday on the 20th. So certainly you can hand it in early by 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. And if you do elect to rewrite that paper, you've got up until the ending of the semester to do so, which is July 6th. Though, of course, the sooner the better for everyone involved. And your journal on Jane Eyre would be due on the 22nd, on Thursday. So at this point, you should have finished reading Persuasion, and you should be in the midst of Jane Eyre. And what I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about Persuasion, to put some closure on it, and to begin our conversation about Jane Eyre. As you know, Persuasion is about the country gentry. These people are not nobility. They're not like the Viscountess Dalrymple, but they're also not servants either. And this family, the Elliot family, serves as a kind of microcosm of their social world. And it's not a very positive portrayal, where manners and decorum and money and status are more important than relationship. That said, we see this through Anne's eyes, who's very different from many of her family members. So what Anne realizes, and of course the author is trying to persuade us to realize, there are multiple levels of persuasion in the text, is that balance and compromise is necessary. You don't want to go to the 2 extremes of either being too cautious or being too reckless. We saw how Anne was too cautious when she wouldn't marry Frederick Wentworth because he hadn't yet established himself in terms of status or money. But you can be too reckless, much like Louisa was too reckless by basically falling off the wall and injuring herself. And this idea of falling, we fall in love, and there's references to falling throughout the text, is something that's important as well. So we definitely have a text that's a satire. It's a parody and mockery of this kind of lifestyle. Again, contrasting this with the harsh reality of the life of a slave girl, I think will put this into full focus. It also is a romance. We get a happy ending. In some ways, it's almost like a Cinderella story where Anne is our Cinderella and the evil sisters, stepsisters, are basically Anne's biological sisters. I don't know if I'd go so far to say that they're evil, but they're certainly not supportive. And I wanted to read just a few quotations to you. The first being at the very beginning of the text. This is when we're introduced to Mrs. Clay. And again, the hypocrisy here that Elizabeth is keeping time with someone who doesn't have status. She's merely a Mrs. She's a widow, which makes some level of concern that she might be perhaps interested in Sir Walter, trying to get his money. Of course, she may not necessarily be aware that he's not as financially stable as he used to be. And of course, part of the reason why is because his wife is no longer alive, Lady Russell. Or I'm sorry, his wife, Lady Elliot, is no longer alive. So that means that there isn't anybody to temper his spending. We do know that Lady Russell is a family friend, but they don't have a relationship with one another. Why would Lady Russell want to compromise her independence and her financial stability by beginning another marriage? But she does serve as a kind of mother figure to Anne. As we know, there are many motherless characters throughout the course of this semester. But Mrs. Clay is talking a little bit about the conversation of work. And I think it's quite telling. For me, this is on page 41 of the edition that I ordered. That she says, I've long been convinced, though every profession is necessary and honorable in its turn, it's only the lot of those who are not obliged to follow any, who can live in a regular way, in the country, choosing their own hours, following their own pursuits, and living on their own property, without the torment of trying for more. It is only their lot, I say, to hold the blessings of health and a good appearance to the utmost. And obviously, appearance is important in this text of the social appearances, keeping up with the Joneses, if you've ever heard that expression. But I love how Mrs. Clay says that this is the regular way to live, where you don't have a job or you don't have financial responsibility. Another quote I wanted to draw your attention to is on page 59. This is where Anne is talking to Mary. And while Mary, the youngest sister, treats Anne better than the oldest sister, Elizabeth, treats Anne, Mary is very self-centered. She oftentimes is subject to fits of exhaustion. It was known as the vapors at the time. It was quite fashionable for women to be overcome with exhaustion. Part of it was legitimate. They were wearing corsets that were so tight that it would interfere with breathing. But part of it also was fashionable, and that it was a way to draw attention to oneself. And Mary definitely wants to be the center of attention. And when Mary asks Anne, as the family is getting ready to move to Bath, about the arrangements, and then Anne says that she had to pack her own things, and Mary says, what can you possibly have to do? And this is Anne's response. Great many things, I assure you, more than I can recollect in a moment, but I can tell you some. I've been making a duplicate of the catalog of my father's books and pictures. I've been several times in the garden with Mackenzie trying to understand and make him understand which of Elizabeth's plants are for Lady Russell. I've had my own little concerns to arrange, books and music to divide, all my trucks to repack, from not having understood in time what was intended as to the wagons. And one thing I had to do, Mary, was of a more trying nature, going to almost every house in the parish to sort of take leave. I was told that they wished it. And this idea that, first of all, that Anne wouldn't have any kind of responsibilities, and notice how Anne talks about her own concerns as if they're quite little and frivolous as compared to all of the familial responsibilities that she would have. This is how Anne began. She's very shy, very introspective, and we definitely see her coming of age and coming into her own as the novel progresses. In part because she's able to see a different lifestyle, the lifestyle of her sisters-in-laws, the Musgroves. And on page 63 in my version of the text, we learned a little bit about them, Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove. They had their own game to guard and to destroy, their own horses and dogs, newspapers to engage them. The females were fully occupied in all the other common subjects of housekeeping and neighbors and dress and dancing and music. And she acknowledged it would be very fitting that every little social commonwealth should dictate its own manners of discourse, and hoped before long to become a not unworthy member of the one she was now transplanted into. In other words, that this is an active family. That's one of the messages we have, because the Elliots basically are just spending their time in complete and total leisure. And that ultimately leads to a deadening of the intellect, which we see with all of the Elliots except for Anne. We know that Benwick loves to read, for instance. Again, the statement about the importance of maintaining activity and being busy. We learn a little bit about the role of mother when Mary is lamenting the fact that her child has been injured, and it's assumed that she needs to stay home and care for the child rather than go meet this new interesting person who has arrived in town, Frederick Wentworth. And what Mary says on page 76, because I'm the poor mother, I'm not to be allowed to stir, and yet I am sure I'm more unfit than anybody else to be around the child. My being the mother is the very reason why my feelings should not be tried. I'm not at all equal to it. You saw how hysterical I was yesterday. So this is her argument, that she's too emotionally invested to take care of her child, that someone like Anne should do it, and then that would free up Mary to join her husband to be able to meet Frederick Wentworth. The thing is, Mary has a certain point that the go-to assumption is that female will take care of child, while male has a level of freedom that female doesn't. But we also find Mary to be incredibly self-centered and incredibly selfish. So it's very difficult to admire her in any kind of way, shape, or form. And of course, we learn about the importance of making a correct match. This is going to be very important when we read something like Jane Eyre, so keep that in mind. And think about how Mary responds to the idea on page 96 or 97 that Henrietta, who happens to be basically her sister-in-law, had better make a good match, because if she doesn't make a good match, well, it's going to reflect badly on Mary. So again, that says everything about how pompous Mary is. Of course, Henrietta is thinking about a clergy person, which is an honorable profession, but doesn't necessarily come with finances. And that's something that will also be important when we read about Jane Eyre. We learn about Captain Harville, of course, when we're introduced to this new world that Wentworth is introducing everyone to. And while Captain Harville on page 120 was no reader, he contrived excellent accommodations and fashioned very pretty shelves for a tolerable collection of well-bound volumes for the property of Captain Benwick. And while his lameness prevented him from taking too much exercise, but a mind of usefulness and ingenuity seemed to furnish him with constant employment within. He drew, he varnished, he carpentered, he glued, he made toys for the children, he fashioned new netting needles and pins with improvements. If everything else was done, he sat down to his large fishing net at one corner of the room. Again, the importance of keeping oneself occupied, being busy, giving oneself mental stimulation. Of course, we know that Frederick Wentworth at one point is contemplating the idea of matching himself with Louisa, because she seems so strong-willed, but of course she goes to the extreme and becomes rather reckless by trying to climb a wall and ultimately, or walk across a wall, and ultimately falls and experiences a very serious injury. Again, another idea of falling here. And Anne is thinking to herself immediately after this on page 139, and wondered if it ever occurred to Frederick, that is, to him now, to question the justness of his own previous opinion as to the universal felicity and advantage of firmness of character, and whether it might not strike him that, Like all other qualities of mind, it should have its proportions and limits. She thought it could scarcely escape him. Um, to feel that a persuadable temper might sometimes be as much in favor of happiness as a very resolute character. Again, the idea of balance. And as I had indicated before, these are long sentences that we have to untangle. Reading them out loud can be very helpful in terms of understanding the plot and understanding the context, too, of the sentences. Even Mrs. Smith, of course, Anne is friends with her old school a chum. Mrs. Smith is keeping busy by making little thread pin cushions and card racks. Constantly throughout the novel, there is reference to the idea of making oneself useful, something that the very rich aren't necessarily doing. And of course, towards the ending of the novel, starting around 263 or so, those wonderful pieces of dialogue where Anne is talking a little bit about the differences in gender, that she says that men's feelings may be the strongest, but I assert that women's are the most tender. Man is more robust than woman, but he's not longer lived, which exactly explains my view of the nature of their attachments. Nay, it would be too hard upon men if it were otherwise. Men have difficulties and privations and dangers enough to struggle with. Men are always laboring and toiling, exposed to every risk and hardship. Men's home and country and friends all quitted, neither time nor health nor life to be called their own. It would be too hard indeed if a woman's feelings were to be added to all of this. And I believe one of you actually referenced this in the discussion forum, that on the next page, page 264, where Anne continues and says, men have had every advantage of women in telling their own story. And of course, this semester we get women telling their own stories, whether it's Mary Shelley showing how invisible women can be and the negative consequences and results of not allowing women to have voice. And then with Jane Austen, we see how important it is for women to maintain social decorum and appearance, both men and women, but especially females, and the need for a good match. Of course, that's part of the problem with Sir Walter Elliot, is that he married purely for money, not for status. And any kind of small social slight, like not paying the correct condolences, could result in a huge rift in the family, which is exactly what we see. Which is what happened with the Lady Dalrymple, or the Viscountess, I should say, Dalrymple. But nevertheless, what we do find out is also the male perspective. Of course, keep this in mind that this is written from a female author, but in the character of Harville, saying on page 265, "Oh, if I could only make you comprehend what a man suffers when he takes a last look at his wife and children and watches the boat that he has sent them off in, as long as it is in night, and then turns away and says, 'God knows whether we ever meet again.' And then, if I could convey to you the glow of his soul when he does see them again, when, coming back after a 12-month's absence perhaps, and obliged to put in another port, he calculates how soon it'd be possible to get them there, pretending to deceive himself and saying they could not be there till such a day, but all the while hoping for them 12 hours sooner, and seeing them arrive at last, as if heaven had given them wings." And, of course, he talks a little bit about his belief that he thinks that women are, or actually I should say Anne says in response, that men are capable of everything great and good in their married lives, but that if she had to make a argument, all the privilege I claim for women, my own sex, and it's not a very enviable privilege, so you need not covet it, is that of loving the longest when existence or hope is gone. Of course, we do have that happy ending. So, now that we're done with Persuasion, I am hopeful that you're finding Jane Eyre to be a very different kind of read. It is a very long novel, but it moves very quickly. Certainly one of my favorite novels. What we've got in Jane Eyre is a Gothic romance, and we talked a little bit about the Gothic tradition with Frankenstein. And we also get social and religious commentary. Written initially under a pseudonym, Currer Bell. And it was assumed that Currer Bell had to be male. In fact, there was a female reviewer. This happens to be in the edition that I had ordered for us. A female reviewer, Elizabeth Rigby, saying in the Quarterly Review that Jane Eyre's author is blamed for the highest moral offense a writer can commit, that of making an unworthy character interesting, and that the book was hence mischievous and vulgar, and it pandered to the public taste for illegitimate romance. Now, I had told you to think a little bit about names, because names are going to be quite important in this novel. Think about the idea of Jane. If you've ever heard the term plain Jane, Jane is not physically attractive, and we've learned in Persuasion what a disadvantage that is for female. Jane is not of any particular social status, and we know what a disadvantage someone is at if they don't have social status. And Jane does not have income or any kind of financial stability. And again, we know what kind of a disadvantage an individual is in that position, especially female. And Jane also doesn't have family. Once again, we've got a motherless Jane who basically is being taken care of by her evil aunt. Again, very much like a kind of fairy tale where, you're being abused and misused by your non-biological family. Not a stepmother, but in effect, Mrs. Reed the aunt is acting much like in the stepmother role. Unlike Anne in Persuasion, who observes and comments, Anne is an active participant. There's a lot of action that goes on in this book. It's one of the reasons why I believe the book moves so quickly. You may have heard of Erica Jong, a very important feminist, who talked about, and this is a quote, Jane may be the first heroine in fiction to know that she needs her own identity more than she needs marriage. Her determination not to relinquish selfhood for love could well belong to a contemporary heroine. And I agree wholeheartedly. What we see is a certain level of independence that one might be hard-pressed to find even today. In terms of Jane Eyre. And this begins in her youth as a child. So that also is another disadvantage that she has, is that as not being an adult, she's subject to the whims of adults. But that doesn't stop her from standing up for herself. So in the preface of the book, what we learn is that conventionality is not morality, and self-righteousness is not religion. So this is Bronte's perspective on what inspired her to write this particular piece. I've always thought of this book as 5 separate books, and that might be helpful to you to do as well in order to manage all of the content. And you can see this in the notes below in the 3rd section under Jane Eyre, that book 1, so to speak, is the Gateshead section. And this is about the first 4 chapters or so. And this is Jane's story when she's living with her aunt, Mrs. Reed. The next part of the story is approximately chapters 5 to 10. And that's the Lowood section. That's when Jane is at boarding school. The next section, the longest section, would be chapters 11 to 27. That's at Thornfield. This is Jane as a young adult. And this is the romance section of the novel. Moor House, also known as Marsh End, would be chapters 28 to 35. If you're seeing any kind of Hollywood adaptations of Jane Eyre, they usually will spend most of their time on the Thornfield section, the romance section, and even cut out things like the Moor House or Marsh End section. And then at the very end, we have Ferndean, and that's in chapters 26 to 38. So I wanted to try to address these as 5 separate books or 5 separate stages in Jane's life. And those first 4 chapters, Gateshead, again, think about the name, gate. A gate can entrap and close. But one can also open a gate and can lead to release. And we're told at the very beginning there's no possibility of taking a walk that day. We know how important walks are by reading Persuasion. It gives you the opportunity to not only get fresh air, but it gives you the opportunity to meet new people. And of course, they wouldn't have many of the technological advances that we have today in order to be able to communicate Jane is sitting cross-legged. Again, that would be very unusual for a female. She's sitting like a boy, in effect. And she's reading, which also is considered quite dangerous, if you remember the Cult of True Womanhood, on a November day. Remember, this text has Gothic elements, so it's dreary, it's November, so the setting is working quite well. And in chapter 2, we find out how Jane is punished because basically she stands up for herself as she's being mistreated by her cousins. And of course, her aunt is going to take not Jane's side, but her own children's side. And she's put into something called a red room. And Jane talks about in chapter 2 that she resisted this punishment, which was a new thing for her. She's just 10 years old. So this is the first act of rebellion we see from her. When she was taken to that red room, which comes with all kinds of superstition associated with it, that perhaps the ghost of her uncle, who is now deceased, Mr. Reed, is there. Again, that would be lots of Gothic possibilities. And in chapter 3, there's an adult Jane reflecting back. Keep in mind that this entire novel is an adult Jane retelling her story. And what adult Jane says in chapter 3 is that she ought to forgive Mrs. Reed and the family. But child Jane didn't want to belong to poor people. So rather than having to live with a poor family, she would prefer to suffer injustice and pain with the family of status, the Reeds. And Jane says, I was not heroic enough to purchase liberty at the price of caste. So her backstory, which is going to be important as the novel continues, is that Jane's birth mother, who came from a certain level of status, had married a poor clergyman. Again, think of persuasion, if you will, and was thus disinherited. And both of Jane's parents died, and the mother's brother, who again would come from some status, Mr. Reed, took in Jane, but then Mr. Reed died, and the aunt, his wife, Mrs. Reed, and think about some of the symbolism associated with reeds, things that are stiff and brittle, grudgingly raised Jane, while Mrs. Reed was spoiling her own children, John, Eliza, and Georgiana. So in chapter 4 is when we begin moving to Jane being transitioned from Lowood to a boarding school, which would not have been unusual for the poor at that time. And boarding schools were known for having very horrific conditions. So part of what Bronte is doing is actually showing us, exposing some of the negative conditions of boarding schools as well in her writing, as well as the pomposity of the rich and those with status, and the hypocrisy of those who claim to have religion but really were not religious. And that includes a Mr. Brocklehurst, who's described as a kind of black pillar, this ridge, hypocritical kind of religion, where he expects the girls at the boarding school to live a life of deprivation, while that is not what he expects for himself and for his own family. And Jane tells Brocklehurst when he asks her, well, what can you do to avoid hell? And Jane responds, well, not die. That was not the answer he was looking for. So we can see that she's a little spitfire. And of course, this is something that she will carry with her throughout the course of the novel. She also boldly stands up to Mrs. Reed and tells Mrs. Reed that she's bad, hard-hearted, and deceitful. Quite a thing for a 10-year-old to be telling an adult, let alone a poor 10-year-old who basically is an orphan. And is subject to the whims of the family that is caring for her. So in chapter 5 is when we move to Lowood. And think about the idea of low, something that is below or something that is poor. Certainly we see that in the conditions of Lowood, where poor children are sent. It's a boarding school with very primitive conditions and many deprivations. There, Jane meets Miss Temple. Think about the idea of a temple. It's a place of safety and refuge, which is what Jane finds in her teacher, Miss Temple, who is Jane's safe temple. Not only educates Jane, education is so important in order for Jane to be able to have a certain level of independence and autonomy, but also it gives Jane the opportunity to meet people like Helen Burns. And Helen Burns, note the last name Burns, Helen Burns burns an impression upon Jane. Helen Burns is very religious, and perhaps too religious. She'd rather live in the afterlife than live in the real world. Jane is very much a passionate woman who thinks that existence is just as important as the afterlife. So that idea of balance, again, is something that we've seen in previous texts and also this text. We know that a young Jane in chapter 8 says that if others don't love me, I'd rather die. I can't bear to be solitary. And of course, and I don't want to give away too many spoilers if you haven't finished the novel yet, but she will learn how to be solitary and to embrace her self-respect, that's much more important. And in chapter 9, Helen dies of tuberculosis, a very common way for individuals to die during the time period. I had suggested that perhaps Helen was a little bit too focused on the afterlife in order to appreciate the joys of living, unlike Jane. And notice how Jane basically spends so much time in nature and finds it rejuvenating, something that we saw with Victor as well on Frankenstein. Nature is healing for Jane, and Jane says this world is pleasant, it would be dreary to be called from it. In chapter 10, we find out that because of investigations, as so many have died of tuberculosis, that improvements were made to Lowood. And that means that ultimately, this is the ending of our commentary about boarding schools. And Jane needs to transition into a new life. She decides that she needs to find a new servitude. And especially because Miss Temple now is going to marry, and as a married woman, she cannot maintain her position as a teacher at the school. So now Jane does something that would be very bold for perhaps anybody, but especially female. She decides to advertise for employment as a governess. So she takes action. Jane is someone who takes action. She's very active. She's not passive. And of course, she's able to get employment at Thornfield. And this is where we move into the next book, so to speak, or as I think of it in the novel. If you think about Thornfield, a field, something that's positive, that's filled with thorns, something that could be dangerous or painful. And we're going to see a combination of the two when Jane goes to Thornfield. Thornfield Estate. This is where she meets the housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax, where Mrs. Fairfax talks about how she's been quite lonely, that the only people really at Thornfield are the servants, and that she can't converse with them in terms of equality. I can't help but think of Walton and Frankenstein, for instance, about saying that he really was alone on the ship because the other shipmates really weren't of the same status. And Mrs. Fairfax is responsible for taking care of a young child of the master of the house, who often is not present, the master, that is. And the child's name is Adele Varens. This is going to be Jane's pupil. And the master of Thornfield is a Mr. Rochester. And there is a possibility, though we don't know for certain, that this is Rochester's illegitimate child. Whether it truly is his biological child or not, he feels a sense of responsibility towards the child because the child was abandoned by her mother. And we'll learn more about that as the novel progresses. And while Jane is at Thornfield, of course, we've got this creepy old estate. It's almost like that Gothic castle. She hears these strange ghost-like laughs. And of course, that's our mystery. Who or what are making these laughs? And that's part of the Gothic element. And Jane talks about that while she was happy on a certain level because she had expanded her world beyond Thornfield to go to, or she had expanded her world beyond Lowood to go to Thornfield. Now she was finding a sense of isolation because there was really only Mrs. Fairfax, the servants, and Adele. And in chapter 12, she says something that I think is quite comparable to what I was talking about with persuasion, remaining busy. Jane said, human beings, this is in chapter 12, must have action. And specifically, this is what she says about women. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They suffer from too rigid a constraint, too absolute a stagnation. It is narrow-minded to say they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano, and embroidering bags. So I think if nothing else, persuasion really gives you an understanding of Jane and of Jane Eyre. Now, Jane decides to take a walk. Of course, we know how important it is to take walks. In chapter 12, she decides to go outdoors to post a letter for Mrs. Fairfax. That means that Jane is out and is able to meet people outside of the house. It turns out that the person she meets is Mr. Rochester himself as he is returning back to the estate. Not that Jane knows this when they initially meet. Rochester is 12 years Jane's senior. And this is where our love story is going to begin blossoming. Rochester, of course, has status. Rochester, of course, has wealth, the exact opposite of poor Jane, plain Jane, governess Jane. And Rochester at this point has fallen off of his horse, and Jane is quite pleased to have been able to do something, an active thing, to assist him. And again, this is not the Mary Elliott that we saw in Persuasion, who constantly feels ill-used. And Rochester is described as masculine and dark and strong and stern. Very much in the Byronic tradition of the Byronic hero, that this is a flawed man that needs to be saved or achieve some level of understanding by the ending of the novel. Jane in chapter 13 shows a certain level of strength and independence that he hasn't seen with any of his staff thus far. And we learn a little bit about Rochester's backstory, that he inherited Thornfield from his older brother who had died, that basically the older brother had inherited the estate, and Rochester, as the younger brother, was made to basically find a suitable match. This is going to be important later on in order to achieve his wealth. But now that his brother has died, he has Thornfield. Again, I think that Persuasion will help you understand a little bit some of the pressures that Rochester might have felt, though we don't get a whole lot of his backstory. And Rochester will ask things of Jane, and she gives some rather spitfire answers. He asks Jane if he's handsome. He's fishing for compliments. She says no. He's never had anybody do something like that to him. Rochester asks Jane to speak. She refuses. Again, he's never seen someone do something like that. Eventually stating, Rochester that is, that nothing freeborn, or I should say, Jane eventually states that nothing freeborn would submit to insolence, even for a salary. And Rochester's never met someone like her before, that someone who cares less about money and position and more about dignity and self-worth. And in chapter 15, we get a rather disturbing episode where Rochester's bed is set on fire. Another mystery that's associated with those laughs, and how did that come about? There is the suspicion that a servant named Grace Poole might be responsible for this. We see how Jane and Rochester get closer, and once again, Jane assists Rochester. She shows herself to be useful and clever, almost like Anne Elliot showed herself to be useful and clever in Persuasion, which would have been eyebrow-raising for many people, that a female could be both useful and clever. And then at that point in chapter 16, as Jane's feelings are beginning to grow, and of course it would be a completely unsuitable match for a governess to fall in love with her master, in effect, Rochester brings a beautiful woman to the house, his girlfriend, a Miss Blanche Ingram. She's beautiful, she's vain, she's arrogant, she's very much like what you would expect in the Elliot family in Persuasion. Rochester also brings his friends, and they begin socializing at Thornfield, and Rochester demands, much to Jane's astonishment, that Jane keep in their company, even though she's not in the same social status. And by this point, she's fallen in love with him, but of course she knows that she doesn't have a chance with him. And she says that she doesn't condemn Rochester for wanting to marry somebody like Blanche Ingram, because of interests and connections. That's what people do of that status. And again, we saw that with the Elliot family. And then in chapter 16, we get the introduction of a new character, a Mr. Mason, someone who mysteriously arrives from Jamaica. So I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to stop here so that we can continue on next class. And you'll also notice in the notes below that I have included a version of Jane Eyre done through the BBC, the British Broadcasting Service. And it was done in 2006, and the BBC is very well renowned and very esteemed. I'm not in any way suggesting that you should watch this in lieu of reading the book, but since this is a long book and this is a condensed semester, it might be of use to you to watch it. This is long. It is in 4 episodes, and each episode is approximately an hour. So just watching Jane Eyre would take you about 4 hours, and it still doesn't cover all of the elements of the text. But it's a very good version of Jane Eyre, so I thought that you might at least like to have that as a possibility. So what's left is our attendance question, which would be due on Saturday, the 17th at 9 a.m. And of course, as always, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And if you need an extension, just ask me and I'll be happy to grant it to you. So thus far in your reading of Jane Eyre, so I realize some of you might be close to finishing the book and some of you might just be beginning the text. Thus far in your reading of Jane Eyre, do you dislike or like the novel Jane Eyre? And why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about Mr. Mason and the rest of Jane Eyre. Take care. Bye-bye.